Welcome to the United States of America.
My name is Charles Faddis. I spent 20 years in the Central Intelligence Agency working terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, in rogue states. I've been face to face with the world's most dangerous people and ideologies, and I've come to one conclusion: that our approach to these problems lacks common sense. That's what this show is about. It's about common sense solutions to the world's most significant problems. Welcome to the United States of Common Sense.
Welcome to the United States of Common Sense. With us today we have Joe Deedon of TAC ONE Consulting to talk to us about active shooter situations and, unfortunately, to bring it around to talking about Newtown. Joe, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invite. Looking forward to chatting with you and your listeners.
Well, look, the first thing I like to do when I'm having this kind of conversation is I like to sort of baseline things. Right, and we use terminology like active shooter, which certainly means a lot to you, means something to me, probably doesn't mean much to most Americans, even though they're familiar with the phenomenon. So can you start by telling us what we mean by an active shooter?
Yeah, an active shooter, by definition, is basically the ongoing life-taking in a very populated environment. So we get caught up on the active shooter, just terminology, but a lot of us kind of refer to them as active assailants as well, because, it can be an edged weapon. We've seen some, regional here in Wyoming, we've seen a gentleman with a crossbow, but it's basically the ongoing taking of life or serious injury in like I said, a very populated environment.
So, this is clearly distinguished then from, say, a hostage situation where you're just holding people and people are not dying as it's progressing.
Right, exactly. It's very fluid. It happens very quickly to where, their goal or what they usually set out to do is just try to take as many lives as they can, prior to, law enforcement's response or anybody else there in their environment that can be, perceived threat.
So look, the average guy, the average lady probably spends most days hoping they don't have to think about this at all. But to the extent that I think most people do think about it, they think about it, think about it and think about how to respond. I think they probably fall back on this general conception that the plan is you just kind of hunker in place, dial 911 and wait for the cavalry. And, what's the problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is you're exactly right. That's what's ingrained in a lot of people's heads is, okay, hunker down, get to the ground. But, these things happen so quickly. And what we talk about is no matter what environment you're in, you've got to have a pre-plan for this type of stuff through your day-to-day activities or your work environment, things like that, to where, you've got to be aggressive. What we found out is, a lot of times, the general makeup of these people, they're somewhat intelligent, they're non-confrontational for the most part, but and that's why they choose the certain venues that they choose, where there's not a real big threat to their safety. They have the upper hand by using the weapons and diversions and stuff. Where we talk about is just being aggressive. A lot of times, just changing their environment, taking them away from just the free reign of that structure, or somebody confronting them saying, hey, what are you doing? And it doesn't even really have to be an armed position of authority, just usually a position of authority or someone that's, like I said, a perceived threat to them, and it forces them to make a couple decisions. So, we tell people to be aggressive, definitely try to evacuate if you can, depending on who you're with, family members, whatnot. You're concerned for their safety as well, but you just can't stand around. You got to do something, confront them, or leave the area as soon as possible.
So, one of the things here, I guess I'm hearing is that, in the time that it takes between the time you dial 911 and the time that the cops are actually going to show up and do what they need to do, you may in fact be dead if your only reaction to this is you're just going to sort of wait in place and hope for somebody else to save you.
Oh, you bet. Statistically, once this life-taking has started playing out, about every 15 seconds another victim is dead. And that's usually very, very quick. So obviously, if you see, your average law enforcement response to, a decent sized department in most areas is probably 3 to 4 minutes in something like this, what we would call priority one call. They've got to get through traffic. They've got to, coordinate their response. They've got to get it dispatched, and dispatch has to go to their cruisers. So if you look at that time frame, and especially some more of the recent shootings, they've all lasted just, fewer than a couple minutes. So again, very important to change that environment right away, to get out of there. And as time goes on, you're going to have less chance of doing that. So
one of the things, or one of the instances that in my experiences, or in my reading and discussing with people, that seems to have really been a catalyst for a lot of the change in thinking was the Columbine school shooting in Colorado that was so horrific. And I'm not the expert, but it seems that really got people thinking seriously about the fact that we maybe needed to revisit a lot of assumptions. Can you explain to us why? I mean, what was it about Columbine that really had such an impact?
Oh, you bet. The biggest impact is that, if you look at the time of events, that truly was one of the first pre-planned attacks, against one of our education, system, the schools. So that just in itself, it brought the idea open that, hey, these things could start happening. People are going to target these places. So that in itself, and the media coverage that got for so long, has kind of, if you look at some of these shooters and Cho and other ones, they've always referred back to Columbine, and it's a cult-like following. Down there in South Jeffco, we would get people, transients from all across the country coming to the Columbine Memorial, either to pay respect to the victims or, the actual shooters themselves. So it's a very, it's a weird thing. And the biggest thing on the law enforcement side of things and how we've evolved in our thinking was, not too many people know this, but we had a deputy, exchange gunfire with one of them outside in the first about 3 minutes. Right. Knowing that we already had, the girl outside that was down, exchanged some gunfire with them, and then, held the perimeter, didn't go inside. So at the time, that was their standard operating procedure across the board. Had this happened anywhere else in the United States, it certainly would have been the same response by law enforcement is, okay, we got people maybe up there, we were getting, reports of possibly up to 12 gunmen, heavily armed inside the school. Okay, well, that's going to slow down our response a little bit anyway. But they looked at it as, okay, set up perimeter. We've got to call our SWAT teams out. I mean, it wasn't a matter of not having enough people there. It's just a matter of, waiting about 40 minutes for that, TAC team to make entry into that school. And there, the killing only took place for about 11 and a half minutes. They were alive a little bit longer than that, up in the library by themselves. But really, when you look at all that, it was isolated to one part of the structure. We didn't really have a plan to evacuate the students at the time. So, it didn't take very long.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I think you're talking about setting up a perimeter and waiting for SWAT. So as I understand it, at the time of those shootings, and again, my implication here is not to cast blame on any law enforcement officers because they were following the doctrine that they were trained in. But it was arrive, as you say, contain, set up a perimeter, in other words, control the site, control the area, and then wait for the SWAT guys to show up to make entry. And as you noted, when it's going to take you a half hour, 40 minutes to get the SWAT team on site, and everybody that matters is going to be dead in 10 minutes, those two things don't really match up.
You bet. Yeah, exactly. And, again, that's was the big change in, our tactics there because, at the time, our priority of life model is the best way we explain it is, it was officer safety first, foremost, and we have, our hostages and then suspects or, different subjects. But And that's how they operate. It's like, it's not safe enough for our guys to go in there, so let's get the guys here with better equipment, better guns, with more protection, better training. So that's how we operated. That's what a SWAT team is for. Hey, when we can't do something, we've got to worry about, bringing all of our cops home at the end of the day. Okay, well, let's send these guys in then, with all their resources. So that's definitely changed, obviously quite dramatically now. We're teaching, officers to go in there by themselves. The most standard thing is the first four guys to show up, but we've even took it one step further and given, single and two officer responses to these things, so they can at least go in there and change that environment, until more help arrives.
Right. And, not to minimize what we're talking about here, because, we're throwing around concepts like that, but we ought to note that, this is a pretty serious thing that you're talking about now. I mean, you're a police officer that shows up at a scene within a few minutes of a shooting. You're obviously, the amount of actual hard concrete information you have is minimal. Everything is chaos, and there's 2, 3, 4 of you on site, and now, what we're expecting these guys to do is go into that building, into that chaos, with no clear idea necessarily of what they're facing. We ought to have a tremendous amount of respect for the guys that are willing to do that, men and women that are willing to do that and take that risk.
Oh, you bet. That's one of the hardest things we'll ever ask a law enforcement officer to do. Is go into that environment where you're probably going to be outgunned in some cases, depending on, who you work for. There might be multiple suspects in there. We've seen, obviously Columbine they're real thick with using, IEDs. Cho stated he had them, but, he didn't end up having them. But, we're training for all that, saying, hey, we know this is going to be the most dangerous thing we're going to ask you to do, especially if we send you there alone into a large structure. You're exposed in a lot of different areas. But again, we've take that prior life model and we say, okay, we got our innocent citizens and hostages, prior, and then we have our law enforcement officers in the middle there, then our suspects last. So, that's just kind of goes back to, okay, what's our priority life model? All right, we put this uniform on each day. This will be your darkest hour, but we're gonna have to throw you in there. And hopefully, hopefully they have what it takes once they get in there.
So talk to me a little bit, if you can, about what you do with TAC ONE. I mean, what are you doing in terms of training people and preparing them for these kinds of situations?
All right. Well, there's two different sides. I have a law enforcement training side and private security. And, what we're teaching, again, is anywhere from a 4-man team element all the way down to a single officer response, single person response. And it's all reality-based training. We get the guys in there using Simunitions, the force on force, as much reps as we can, actually doing the movements, doing the rescues. And like I said, we go anywhere from a 4-man to a 1-man. So, depending on the size of the department, the environment, private security. Sometimes they only have a couple armed people on scene. And we give them the tools necessary to hopefully be a little more successful, at least in stopping the life taking, so that we start rescuing victims and the citizen side. I do a concealed carry personal protection courses where we're starting to talk about a lot of this, being out in a public setting if they're going to carry out in public, and things to be aware of, situational awareness, and getting a defensive shooting position, getting your back to a wall, keep moving. And being aggressive at the very onset of it, because again, some of these actions, just changing that environment to where you have another armed presence in that situation, is a lot of times is all we need for these guys to make that decision, and ultimately they end up taking their own lives.
I'm curious, particularly when you talk about training private citizens, or even maybe training security guards who aren't necessarily always signing up thinking that they're really going to get, that they're going to have shots fired. I mean, what kind of reaction do you get when you start talking about this kind of harsh reality to people, saying, to an average guy, hey, this could really happen to you and you need to be prepared for it?
Right. Probably about a year or two ago, there's a little bit of resistance with some of these people, but there's been so many of them lately that, I think everybody kind of realizes that they're getting extremely violent right away. Law enforcement's going to get there as fast as they can, and we have, the training to deal with it once we get there. But in a harsh reality, we all know that we can't be there, everywhere. So we can't put a police officer in every school. Should we? I think we should, but that's just financially not going to happen in this country. And again, we can't be in every mall, during the holidays. So I think more and more people are realizing that, hey, this really could happen to me or my family. And then you even got those security guards that, sign up and not necessarily knowing they're going to have to deal with this. But I think it's been such a big thing right now, in the trend here, that people are, one, getting sick and tired of seeing it, and two, saying, hey, we've got to change our thinking here. We've got to be able to defend ourselves or protect ourselves from, going to the mall or going out to dinner.
Right. So let's talk, about something that's almost too horrible to talk about, at least for me personally. But that's Newtown and the school shooting that has occurred here recently, with all of these elementary school kids being killed. I mean, can you talk about this in the context of what we're talking about here, active shooter situations, and how to respond to it?
You bet. Again, the dynamics on this one, obviously very quick. It was isolated, those two rooms there, seems, for the most part. So it looks like they had some, security kind of measures already in place. I guess we'll find out in the coming months in the investigation, how effective that was, or, obviously we can't, nothing's foolproof. If they want to gain access to that structure, they're going to gain access to it. But again, what we're seeing is, going to an elementary school where there it is, you've got a lot of unarmed teachers and young kids that can't, can't pose a threat to you, versus going into a high school. And then, I don't like to talk about their names, but the gentleman who did that, I don't want to call him gentleman monster, I guess. He was about 20 years old. So, he's not going to go into a high school, where there's guys that are about his age, females, males, whatever, that could pose a threat. And that's what they typically try to do. They want that upper hand. They want to go in somewhere where they're going to meet minimal resistance. And, unfortunately, with everything that he did and his plan, he always had enough time to carry it out. And that's the thing. We know that they're going to happen, and try to get there as soon as we can. But, it's, like I said, every 15 seconds, the life is taken. So I think, you'll start seeing a little bit more school districts looking at different things. And, maybe, I know Utah has a thing in there where, you have a concealed weapon, and school faculty can actually carry there already. There's been some talk, I've seen some places in Texas thinking about drafting that. So, those teachers, they go through the same background checks, typically as law enforcement does, to make sure they're not a criminal and they can be trusted with our youth, like the police and fire services. So, if they, show some proficiency and the willingness to carry, and, they put together some type of qualification program for them or what have you, because right now, all we're doing is teaching them to lock the doors and hide. They did the best they could trying to hide some of these students there. But I think we got to take a real hard look at our society and say, okay, we need to do something. We've got some tools out there for school faculty, but we still leave them hanging quite a bit because we don't teach them anything after. Okay, you know what? Get away from the windows, lock the door, hide your kids, turn off your lights. Let's see who breaches that door. What are you going to do now? Why isn't it so important? Basic firearm knowledge. What are you going up against? You got a revolver, 6 rounds. You got a semi-automatic pistol. Do they know what it looks like when he has a malfunction? When he's reloading. Things like that. We've started to put in some of our school faculty training is, basic firearm knowledge, because a lot of the school faculty members may or may not, depending on their upbringing and what they like to do on their own time, they may not know. Hey, this is a revolver and you have 6 shots, or it's an AR-15 and, he's got several rounds. So, and how those things cycle and how they malfunction. And, how to maybe defeat them if they could, or what they're up against at the very least.
One of the things that I have heard people tell me, you've talked a lot about this general concept, which is effectively you got to get aggressive. You got to think for yourself. The plan of simply waiting for somebody else to save your life, it is not going to get you through this critical window between the beginning of the event and the time that law enforcement arrives. I have heard people talk about concepts like rush and crush is a term that gets used. In other words, a reference to the fact that at places like Columbine, we've had incidents where shooters stand in a room and kill individuals one at a time over an extended period, while everyone in effect waits to die, as opposed to, acting collectively and getting rid of this guy. Is that something you talk about at all?
Right. Yeah, we do. We touch on that because, it's so effective. And again, the makeup of these guys are non-confrontational, and that's something where, unfortunately, though, a lot of the school districts, out there across the nation are going to be very reluctant to tell their kids, hey, if somebody comes in here, one of your classmates or a student, whatever, you're middle school on up, high school, you got to be aggressive. Don't sit here and be a victim, and don't comply. We've had this obviously at, Virginia Tech, some other areas there where, he went into these classrooms several times, bounced back and forth, killing people. Well, hey, if I didn't know his intentions the first time, the next time this guy comes in this room, I imagine what's going to happen. So that's the problem. We fall a little short there. Again, is being, comply, being pacifist instead of being aggressive. But I think that's opened a lot of eyes now too, is where, what, one of you may get shot, but at least there's not going to be 12 of you. Let's try to rush this person, change their environment. We've seen a few of them, adults type, situations in different public settings where that's worked. It's kind of one of those things where we need to change everybody's mentality and saying, hey, this is the harsh reality of the society we live in. We're no longer safe really in in our own schools or, churches, things like that, where we've got to start dealing with these people a little bit differently instead of act like it's not going to exist, and being, super compliant is going to be the best thing to do. It's not, just like anything else. We always talk, to sexual assault victims, things like that, saying you need to fight back, right off the bat, and then FBI studies have shown that, people being attacked if you're non-compliant, but if you fight back at the very beginning, it's actually overall better for you in the long run, depending on what situation it is. So we need to take that model and, and kind of take a look at it and say, hey, this is, and that's the whole thing. These guys, once they get challenged and they're not having that free reign and they're getting a little resistance, they end up making a decision, and a lot of times it is taking their own lives. So.
Well, listen, Joe, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I also want to thank you seriously for what you're doing out there, because it is a horrible thing that we're dealing with this, but you're absolutely right. This is the new reality. It's not going away. It seems to be increasing in frequency, and closing our eyes and wishing it wasn't so is not going to help. Next thing you know, you're going to find yourself in the situation yourself, and you're going to have to make these decisions. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching the United States of Common Sense.